Hello, and welcome to History at Bedtime. 8 years after his consecration, an emperor conquered Kalinga and began counting what victory had cost. The land lay on the eastern coast of the Indian subcontinent, where rivers descended from forested hills toward the Bay of Bengal. The exact battlefield has not been identified with certainty. Later tradition placed its memory near the Daya River, where water bends past low hills and fertile ground. Years afterward, far from the conquered coast, the emperor's public confession was cut into rock at sites across his empire. At Khalsi, below the Himalayan foothills, the inscription still counts the dead and the deported. 150,000 people, he declared, had been carried away. 100,000 had been killed. Many times that number had died later. Ancient royal numbers often magnify, and no modern historian can recover an exact total. Yet the purpose of the inscription was not to boast. The emperor wanted subjects far from the battlefield to know that he regretted what conquest had done. His name was Ashoka. He belonged to the Mauryan dynasty, the first state to rule most of the subcontinent from one imperial center. His grandfather had created the empire through war and alliance. Ashoka had enlarged it through the same means. After Kalinga, however, he announced that the greatest victory was no longer conquest by the sword, but conquest by Dhamma, moral conduct, restraint, generosity, respect, and concern for living beings. The statement was extraordinary, but it was not simple. Ashoka did not dissolve his armies. He did not abandon punishment, taxation, or royal authority. His empire still rested upon officials, roads, garrisons, forests, mines, farms, and the ability to compel obedience. The remorse of a conqueror became another form of command, inscribed in stone and placed where travelers, monks, merchants, soldiers, and local rulers would encounter it. Standing before that rock at Khalsi, a person could hear several histories at once. There was the history of imperial ambition, which had brought Ashoka's army to distant Kalinga. There was the history of philosophical questioning, which had taught that violence binds human beings to suffering. There was the history of rivers and roads, along which grain, armies, stories, and sacred ideas moved. And beneath all of them lay a much older history, belonging to cities whose names Ashoka himself may not have known. More than 2,000 years before Kalinga, people had built large, carefully planned settlements along the Indus and its tributaries. They had drained streets, standardized bricks, measured weights, carved seals, stored grain, worked copper, drilled stone beads, and traded across the Arabian Sea. Their script remains unread. Their kings, if they had kings, are unknown. Their prayers cannot be repeated. Ancient India does not begin with one dynasty, one language, one religion, or one river. It begins with many landscapes and with long gaps in memory. Mountains separated valleys. Monsoon winds determined harvests and sailing seasons. Forests opened and closed routes. Rivers shifted their channels, created fields, erased settlements, and carried communities toward new centers. The connecting current begins beside the Indus, where an urban civilization left thousands of signs no one can yet read, and moves east toward the Ganges Plain, where sacred speech, new kingdoms, and wandering teachers changed the meaning of power. From there it passes through Ashoka's empire, ocean trade, epic poetry, monasteries, temples, and the courts of the Guptas. Cities will fall, languages will change, and no empire will contain the entire subcontinent. Yet rivers, recited words, translated stories, and methods of calculation will carry parts of these worlds far beyond the rulers who first supported them. Long before the first known Indian emperor, the Indus crossed a broad plain and divided into channels before reaching the Arabian Sea. Snow and rain from the Himalayas fed its upper waters. Seasonal floods renewed some fields and destroyed others. To the east, River systems now altered or vanished once carried water through regions that later became dry. Along this changing network, farming villages gradually became towns. The process began millennia before the great cities. At places such as Murgar, communities cultivated wheat and barley, kept cattle, sheep, and goats, made pottery, and developed crafts over many generations. There was no sudden moment when a village woke as a civilization. Population accumulated. Exchange widened. Techniques became more specialized. Settlements learned to coordinate labor across distances. By about 2600 BCE, a shared urban culture extended across an enormous territory covering parts of present-day Pakistan, northwest India, and neighboring regions. Archaeologists call it the Indus civilization or the Harappan civilization, after Harappa, one of the first major sites excavated. More than 1,000 related settlements are now known, ranging from small villages and craft centers to cities such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, and Ganarwala. Their similarity is striking without being complete. Bricks often followed standardized proportions. Weights used related systems. Seals displayed animals and short inscriptions. Pottery, ornaments, tools, and urban forms connected distant communities. Yet each region adapted to local materials and water. Mohenjo-daro rose on the Indus plain. Dholavira stood in the harsh landscape of Kutch, where seasonal streams and limited rainfall made storage essential. Coastal settlements looked toward maritime trade. Inland towns connected farms to larger routes. Walk through Mohenjo-daro in imagination before heat and salt damage its walls. Streets meet at deliberate angles. Houses present plain outer walls to public lanes and open inward around courtyards. Some contain bathing platforms. Wastewater flows through brick channels toward covered drains. Wells bring water close to households. Stairs suggest upper floors that no longer survive. Doors often avoid opening directly onto the largest streets, preserving a degree of privacy. The drainage system did not make the city modern, clean, or equal. Drains clogged. Laborers had to remove waste. Access differed between households. Still, the investment reveals priorities. Urban life required repeated maintenance, agreed dimensions, and people responsible for construction beyond a single family. Someone decided where streets should run. Someone ensured that bricks made in different places could fit shared designs. Someone mobilized workers to rebuild after floods. At Dholavira, water shaped the city even more visibly. Reservoirs cut and built around the fortified settlement captured seasonal flows. Channels directed scarce water. Stone architecture divided areas of different scale and access. A person entering from the dry landscape would have seen walls, gateways, open ceremonial space, workshops, houses, and great basins holding the resource upon which every life depended. Harappan cities were organized, but their political order remains hidden. Mesopotamia and Egypt covered monuments with named rulers. Their kings displayed conquest, divine ancestry, and ritual authority. Indus sites have produced no clear royal tombs, giant statues of monarchs, or long inscriptions celebrating victory. This does not prove an equal society or the absence of kings. Houses varied in size. Fortified sectors and restricted areas suggest hierarchy. Rare materials and skilled objects reveal unequal access. The silence creates temptation. Some observers imagine peaceful merchant republics. Others imagine priestly councils, hidden monarchs, or networks of competing cities. Archaeology can test parts of these pictures, but cannot yet select one with confidence. Power may have been expressed through control of trade, ritual, water, craft, and standardized practice rather than through colossal royal images. The objects themselves traveled far. Carnelian beads from the Indus world reached Mesopotamia. Shell came from coasts. Lapis lazuli moved through long chains from regions farther north. Copper arrived from several sources, including Oman and the Iranian plateau. Mesopotamian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, widely associated with the Indus region, and mention ships, merchants, woods, stones, ivory, and animals from the east. A maritime voyage required knowledge of winds, currents, water, food, and negotiation at foreign ports. Cargo passed from boat to boat and language to language. An Indus merchant in a Mesopotamian city may have needed an interpreter. A seal pressed into clay could identify a person, household, office, or shipment. We cannot read the signs, but we can still understand the need to make identity portable. Hundreds of seals show a short row of symbols above an animal. One creature, often called the unicorn, appears frequently, though it does not resemble a natural animal. Other seals show bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, buffalo, and composite beings. A small perforation suggests some seals could be worn or carried. Their inscriptions are usually brief, too brief to reveal grammar easily. The Indus script is one of the great unresolved problems of ancient history. Thousands of examples survive on seals, tablets, pottery, copper objects, and other materials, but no long bilingual inscription has been found. The underlying language is unknown. Scholars have proposed connections with Dravidian languages, Indo-Aryan languages, lost language families, religious symbols, administrative notation, or systems that may not encode full speech. None has achieved general acceptance. That uncertainty must govern every interpretation of Indus religion. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro may have supported ritual bathing, but its exact use is unknown. Figurines once confidently called mother goddesses may have served many purposes. A famous seal showing a seated figure surrounded by animals has been linked to a later form of Shiva, but the connection across nearly 2,000 years cannot be assumed. Fire installations at some sites may have been domestic, industrial, or ritual. Later Indian traditions may preserve distant echoes of earlier practices, but continuity is not a straight, unbroken line. Cultures borrow, forget, reinterpret, and invent. A river can continue flowing while every settlement upon its bank changes name. Daily life is easier to approach through practical remains. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, pulses, sesame, dates, and in some regions rice and millets. Cotton was grown and woven, making the Indus world one of the earliest centers of cotton textile production. Cattle pulled carts and plows. Water buffalo, sheep, goats, and other animals supported food, labor, and exchange. Fish and wild resources supplemented diets according to region. Craft specialists shaped shell bracelets, faience, stone beads, copper tools, pottery, toys, and ornaments. Drilling a long carnelian bead demanded patience and specialized equipment. Firing standardized bricks required fuel, clay, temperature control, and planning. A city's apparent order rested upon thousands of repetitive tasks performed by people whose names are gone. Children left traces in small carts, animal figurines, marbles, and objects that may have been toys or teaching tools. Fingerprints remain in clay, where appears on thresholds. Broken pottery accumulates in lanes. The civilization that looks silent from a museum case was noisy with animals, grinding stones, merchants, construction, conversation, and monsoon rain striking roofs. For several centuries, the urban network endured. Then its patterns changed. After about 1900 BCE, many large cities lost population. Long-distance standardization weakened. Some crafts declined or moved. Writing disappeared from use. Trade with Mesopotamia diminished. Settlements shifted eastward and toward smaller rural forms. This was not one night of invasion or one final burning. It was a prolonged transformation unfolding differently across regions. Older histories blamed conquering Aryans who destroyed the cities. Archaeology does not support a simple invasion causing urban collapse. Climate and rivers now occupy more attention. Monsoon systems changed. Some river channels shifted or became less dependable. Repeated drought and altered flooding would have damaged agriculture and made the maintenance of large urban populations increasingly difficult. Trade networks also changed. Local political and social responses mattered. People did not disappear when cities declined. They moved, adapted, and carried skills into new communities. Some remained near old centers. Others settled where rainfall and rivers were more reliable. The end of the Harappan urban system was not the end of human continuity in the Northwest. Yet a profound break remains. The script ceased. The system of weights and seals lost its old reach. Later inhabitants saw mounds without knowing the names of the cities beneath them. Harappa itself gave bricks to railway builders in the 19th century before archaeologists understood their age. A civilization once connected by measurement became a puzzle reconstructed from fragments. As Harappan cities transformed, new communities speaking early Indo-Aryan languages were becoming part of the northwestern subcontinent. Their arrival and interaction with existing populations unfolded over generations, not as one army crossing one border. Language, ancestry, ritual, and identity mixed in ways that modern political categories often distort. They brought traditions preserved not in brick inscriptions, but in sound. The oldest surviving layer became the Rigveda, a collection of hymns composed in archaic Sanskrit and transmitted orally with extraordinary precision. The people who first shaped these verses lived in a world of cattle, horses, chariots, rivers, clans, chiefs, sacrifice, feud, generosity, and praise. Their gods moved through storm, fire, dawn, intoxication, oath, and battle. The cities of the Indus had gone silent because their signs could no longer be read. Vedic memory chose another defense against forgetting. It placed the text inside disciplined human voices. A Vedic hymn was not read silently from a page. It was heard, repeated, corrected, and memorized. Teachers trained students to preserve pitch, accent, sequence, and pronunciation. Different methods of recitation broke verses apart and recombined them so that errors could be detected. For centuries, this oral discipline carried texts with a fidelity that writing alone did not guarantee. The Rigveda contains more than 1,000 hymns addressed to deities and ritual powers. Agni, fire, carries offerings between human beings and gods. Indra breaks obstacles, releases waters, and wins battles. Soma is plant, drink, deity, and altered state. Ushas, dawn, arrives radiant and then passes, reminding the poet that every new morning also shortens life. These hymns do not present one fixed theology. They ask, praise, bargain, wonder, and contradict. One famous creation hymn imagines a time before existence and non-existence, before sky and air, then ends by questioning whether even the highest overseer knows how creation began. Doubt appears not outside the sacred tradition, but within it. Early Vedic society was organized around kin groups and mobile or semi-settled communities rather than large territorial states. Cattle represented wealth, status, food, and ritual value. Chiefs distributed gifts and led war bands. Assemblies may have participated in decisions, though their composition and power are uncertain. Horses and chariots carried prestige beyond their practical use. The Sanskrit word Arya in these texts meant something closer to noble, respectable, or belonging to a cultural community. It was never the biological racial category later European theorists constructed. 19th and 20th century misuse of the term attached fantasies of race to ancient language history and produced consequences far removed from the Vedic world. Indo-Aryan languages belong to the broader Indo-European family, linking Sanskrit distantly with Iranian, Greek, Latin, and many later European languages. Similar words for kinship, numbers, animals, and ritual reveal ancient linguistic connections. Language, however, does not move without people, and people do not move without mixing. Archaeology and genetics describe migrations and interaction, not a pure population replacing another. As centuries passed, the focus of settlement moved eastward. Forests of the upper Ganges plain were cleared in stages. Iron tools became more common, though iron alone did not create agriculture. Rice cultivation, rainfall, river soils, population growth, and new political organization combined to support larger settlements. The rivers named in early hymns belonged mainly to the northwest. Later texts increasingly knew the Ganges and Yamuna. Geography entered sacred imagination, while communities entered new landscapes. A river was a route, boundary, water source, danger, goddess, and memory at once. Vedic ritual also grew more elaborate. Sacrifices could involve carefully constructed altars, precise recitation, specialized priests, gifts, animals, clarified butter, grain, and long sequences of action. The sponsor sought sons, cattle, victory, reign, status, or access to heaven. Correct performance mattered because ritual was understood to sustain order between human society and the cosmos. Specialized knowledge strengthened the position of Brahmins, the ritual experts who preserved and interpreted sacred speech. Kings and chiefs needed them for consecration and legitimacy. Brahmins needed patrons capable of providing gifts. Power moved through exchange between throne and altar. Social categories became more formal in later Vedic literature. The four Varnas placed Brahmins as priests, Kshatriyas as rulers and warriors, Vaishyas as producers and traders, and Shudras as servants or laboring groups. A late hymn of the Rig Veda imagined these categories emerging from the cosmic person: mouth, arms, thighs, and feet. This scheme was an idealized model, not a complete description of every village. Actual society contained clans, occupations, tribes, local communities, enslaved people, forest populations, migrants, and groups who did not fit for labels. Over time, thousands of jatis, birth and occupational communities, shaped marriage, work, status, and daily interaction. Varna and jati related to each other without being identical. Hierarchy hardened unevenly. Texts composed by elite men often presented social order as divinely grounded and male authority as natural. Women appear as household managers, ritual participants, poets, queens, debaters, workers, and property holders in different periods, but their freedom varied sharply by class, region, and family. Later legal traditions generally restricted them more than idealized memories of an earlier age suggest. People outside accepted hierarchies could face severe exclusion. Ideas of purity and pollution separated occupations and bodies. Communities associated with death, waste, leather, or other stigmatized work were pushed to the margins. The long development of untouchability cannot be assigned to one moment, but ancient social ordering created foundations that later became deeply oppressive. The same tradition that organized hierarchy also generated questions that unsettled every fixed identity. Between roughly the 8th and 5th centuries BCE, texts later called the early Upanishads began asking what sacrifice meant when transferred inward. Could ritual knowledge overcome death? What was the self that remained beneath changing body, thought, desire, and dream? Was the deepest reality outside the person or already present within? Teachers answered through dialogue, paradox, story, silence, and argument. A father instructed a son by dissolving salt in water. The salt could no longer be seen, but every drop tasted of it. A king questioned a Brahmin. A woman named Gargi challenged the sage Yajnavalkya before an assembly, asking what supported the fabric of existence. Maitreyi asked whether wealth could make her immortal and refused to be distracted when told it could not. No single sentence summarizes the Upanishads. Some identify the deepest self, Atman, with Brahman, the ground of reality. Some emphasize breath, consciousness, space, or an imperishable principle. They develop ideas of karma, rebirth, and liberation that become central across Indian traditions. Karma had once referred strongly to ritual action. It increasingly came to mean action carrying moral consequence beyond one lifetime. Rebirth transformed inequality and mortality into part of a vast cycle, samsara. Liberation, moksha, meant release from that cycle through knowledge, discipline, devotion, or combinations still being debated. These ideas did not arise in isolation from social change. By the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, towns and trade were expanding across the Ganges plain. Metal currency circulated. Merchants accumulated wealth not easily described by old cattle-based ideals. Kings governed territories larger than clans. People met teachers from different communities along roads and in market towns. The old sacrifice required a household, property, priests, and social rank. Wandering renouncers asked whether leaving the household might open another path. They were called shramanas, strivers. Some practiced fasting, breath control, meditation, celibacy, nakedness, silence, exposure to heat and cold, or radical nonviolence. Some denied rebirth. Some believed everything was determined by fate. Some argued that matter alone existed. Others sought knowledge beyond language. The intellectual world was not a polite modern seminar. Teachers competed for followers and royal support. Debates could determine prestige, gifts, and the future of a community. A seeker might study under several masters before forming a new path. Monasteries and ascetic groups developed their own rules and memories. Jain tradition remembers Vardhamana Mahavira as the 24th Tirthankara, a ford maker who renewed a path across the river of rebirth. Born into a leading family, he renounced household life, practiced severe austerity, and taught a demanding ethic of nonviolence. For Jain monks and nuns, ahimsa extended toward every living being. Careful walking reduced harm to insects. Food, speech, possession, and movement became moral questions. Lay followers practiced less extreme forms while supporting the ascetic community. Jainism also developed a sophisticated pluralism. Reality has many aspects, and statements may be true from one perspective without exhausting the whole. This intellectual humility did not make Jain discipline easy. Liberation required freeing the soul from karmic matter accumulated through action and passion. The path demanded restraint few could complete in one life. Yet Jain communities became enduring parts of Indian commercial, artistic, and philosophical history. Around the same broad period, another seeker left a privileged household near the Himalayan foothills. The details of his life come through traditions written down generations after his death. They preserve historical memories shaped by teaching, devotion, and narrative art. His name was Siddhartha Gautama of the Sakya community. Later biographies called his father a king and described a palace designed to protect the child from sorrow. The political reality may have been a smaller oligarchic clan whose leading family possessed status rather than a vast royal court. The famous story of the Forsytes belongs to sacred biography. Siddhartha leaves protected surroundings and encounters an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering renouncer. Whether four such meetings occurred in one sequence cannot be known. The story gives visible form to the question that drove the tradition. Why do people live as though age, illness, and death concern someone else? He married and had a son. Then he left, Later poets imagined the night in painful detail. His wife and infant asleep, the horse's hooves muffled, the servant following until the prince removes ornaments, cuts his hair, and exchanges luxury for the clothing of a wanderer. The act can appear heroic from the perspective of renunciation and devastating from the perspective of the family left behind. Ancient India's search for liberation often placed household obligation and spiritual departure in tension. Gautama studied meditation under respected teachers and reached refined states of concentration. He concluded that these attainments did not end suffering permanently. He then joined ascetics who reduced food and body almost to death. Traditions describe him touching his spine through his abdomen and collapsing from weakness. Extreme denial had not produced awakening. Luxury had not produced it either. He accepted food, recovered strength, and lost companions who believed he had abandoned the path. Then he sat beneath a fig tree near the village of Yeruvala, later Bodh Gaya, and resolved not to rise until he understood. The river nearby was the Niranjana, generally identified with the modern Lilajan, which joins the wider Falga river system. It belonged to the Gangetic world through which teachers and merchants moved. Under the tree, later tradition gathered temptations, memories, fear, cosmic vision, and the assault of Mara, embodiment of delusion and death. By dawn, Gautama had become the Buddha, the awakened one. What he claimed to understand began not with a theory of creation, but with experience. Conditioned existence is marked by dukkha, suffering, instability, frustration, the inability of changing things to provide permanent satisfaction. Dukkha arises through craving, grasping, and ignorance. It can cease. A path of ethical conduct, mental discipline, and understanding leads toward that cessation. The formulation became known as the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. It was taught in many forms rather than as one slogan. Right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration supported one another. Wisdom without ethics was incomplete. Meditation without understanding was incomplete. The Buddha rejected both indulgence and self-torture as extremes and taught a middle way. He also questioned the permanent self sought by some Upanishadic thinkers. What people call a person can be examined as changing body, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. None remains fixed or fully controllable. Clinging to any of them as an eternal self creates suffering. This teaching of not-self did not amount simply to saying that human beings do not exist. It challenged the instinct to find an unchanging owner inside experience. The argument would generate centuries of Buddhist philosophy. After awakening, the Buddha hesitated, according to tradition, because the insight was difficult and human beings were attached to desire. He was persuaded to teach. At a deer park near Varanasi, he found the former companions who had abandoned him and delivered the first sermon. A community began with 5 former companions. The first Buddhist community did not remain beside the deer park. Monks traveled during dry seasons, teaching in villages, cities, parks, and royal compounds. During the monsoon, they settled temporarily, because constant movement would damage crops and small creatures, and because heavy rain made travel difficult. These rains retreats gradually encouraged permanent monasteries. The Buddha spoke in languages understood by audiences rather than insisting upon the sacred prestige of Vedic Sanskrit. His teaching reached merchants, artisans, kings, courtesans, farmers, Brahmins, and people of low social status. Entry into the monastic community did not erase every hierarchy or social habit, but birth alone did not determine spiritual capacity. Women also sought ordination. Buddhist tradition remembers Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's aunt and foster mother, asking repeatedly to enter the wandering life. The community of nuns was eventually established under additional rules that placed it below the monks' order. The account reflects both an opening and a limit. Women could pursue full liberation, yet institutions carried the gender assumptions of their world. Laypeople did not need to leave home. They supported monks and nuns with food, cloth, medicine, and shelter, received ethical instruction, and sought merit. Monasteries often grew near trade routes in cities where donors could sustain them. A banker or guild leader might finance a hall. A ruler might grant a grove. Religious renunciation depended materially upon household society, even while criticizing attachment. The Ganges plain through which the Buddha traveled was divided among states later remembered as the 16 Mahajanapadas, the Great Realms. Some were monarchies. Others, such as the Vajji Confederacy, used assemblies dominated by leading families. Their boundaries shifted, and the neat later list should not be mistaken for a stable map. Cities such as Rajagraha, Shrivasthi, Kaushambi, Varanasi, Vaishali, and Kampa became centers of court, trade, and debate. Fortified walls protected storehouses and inhabitants. Roads carried salt, textiles, metal, grain, timber, and information. Punch-marked silver coins made some exchanges easier, though barter and payment in kind continued. One kingdom gained a decisive advantage, Magadha, in the lower Ganges region of present-day Bihar. Its position offered fertile land, access to rivers, forests, elephants, and routes toward eastern India. Nearby iron resources may have supported tools and weapons, though geography alone did not guarantee empire. Magadha's rulers also built alliances, fortified capitals, and absorbed rivals through war and diplomacy. Bimbisara, remembered as a contemporary and patron of the Buddha, strengthened Magadha through marriage and conquest. His son Ajatashatru seized the throne, according to traditions that make him responsible for imprisoning or killing his father. He fought the Vajji Confederacy in a long struggle involving military devices, intrigue, and patient division of opponents. The capital eventually shifted toward Pataliputra, near the meeting of the Ganges and Sun rivers. The location controlled movement through the plain. Boats could carry officials, soldiers, timber, tribute, and grain. A city at the confluence could watch the river system that made wider rule possible. The Buddha's teaching unfolded beside this political expansion. He advised kings without becoming their minister, accepted gifts without making one dynasty sacred, and repeatedly returned attention to impermanence. Kingdoms rise through conditions and pass when conditions change. Bodies do the same. Near the end of his life, he traveled north through communities he had visited for decades. At Kushinagara, after illness, he lay between trees and died. Modern dating remains debated, with many scholars placing his death around the late 5th or early 4th century BCE rather than accepting every traditional chronology. His final instruction, as preserved in one tradition, was that conditioned things decay and that followers should strive diligently. The body was cremated. Relics were divided among claimants and placed beneath mounds called stupas. These monuments became places of memory, pilgrimage, donation, and later artistic transformation. The teacher who had warned against attachment to a permanent self became present across landscapes through fragments associated with his body. Councils were later said to have gathered teachings and monastic rules. The exact history of the earliest councils is difficult to reconstruct. For generations, different communities preserved collections through oral recitation. Agreement was substantial enough for a recognizable tradition to spread, but variation appeared early. Meanwhile, Magadha continued expanding under dynasties that later Buddhist and Jain sources remembered with hostility or legend. The Nandas accumulated wealth and commanded large forces. Greek writers, hearing reports from the northwest, described the ruler of the Ganges kingdom as immensely powerful and unpopular. In 327 BCE, another conqueror entered the subcontinent from the northwest. Alexander of Macedon had already destroyed the Persian Empire and marched through Central Asia. Crossing the Hindu Kush, he fought local rulers in regions now divided between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some submitted. Others resisted from hill forts and river valleys. At the Hydaspes River, probably the Jhelum, Alexander faced King Porus in 326 BCE. Monsoon rain and the swollen river complicated movement. Porus deployed war elephants, animals unfamiliar enough to frighten horses and disrupt formations. Alexander crossed upstream undercover and won a difficult battle. The encounter became famous through Greek storytelling. Asked how he wished to be treated, Porus supposedly answered, like a king. Alexander restored him and enlarged his territory. Whether the exchange occurred exactly so, it expressed an imperial method. Defeated rulers could become useful if honor bound them to the victor. Alexander's army then reached the Hyphasis, the Bias River, and refused to continue east. Soldiers had campaigned for years. Rain fell. Reports described more kingdoms, elephants, and the great power beyond the Ganges. Alexander argued, waited, and sacrificed. The refusal held. He turned south along the Indus, fighting communities that resisted and suffering a serious wound. Fleets explored the river and coast. Garrisons and governors were left behind. Then he departed through brutal desert routes toward the west and died in Babylon in 323 BCE. His Indian conquests were limited in space and duration, but the invasion disturbed the northwest and linked political worlds more directly. Greek and Macedonian officers, local rulers, Iranian traditions, and Indian powers competed after his death. New opportunities appeared for an ambitious man from Magadha. His name was Chandragupta Maurya. The sources disagree about his origins. Later traditions make him low-born, royal, connected to the Nandas, or protected by remarkable signs. Greek accounts describe a young man who may have seen Alexander and later mocked the Nanda ruler's weakness. Jain stories connect his final years to renunciation. The legend grows around the fact that he rose rapidly during a moment of political fracture. He is closely associated with Chanakya, also called Kautilya or Vishnugupta, a Brahmin strategist who became the model of the ruthless advisor. Stories describe an insult at the Nanda court, a vow of revenge, secret recruitment, patient planning, and the education of Chandragupta for kingship. The famous Arthashastra is traditionally attributed to Kautilya. It contains detailed discussion of taxation, spies, courts, trade, agriculture, diplomacy, war, mines, forests, prostitution, weights, disasters, and royal discipline. Yet the text in its surviving form likely developed over a long period and cannot simply be read as a government handbook written entire by one minister for Chandragupta. Still, it preserves a political intelligence suited to the age of expanding states. The king should wake early, divide the day into tasks, hear reports, inspect revenue, consult advisors, and guard against assassination. Spies should test officials and watch enemies. Forts, grain stores, roads, mines, irrigation, and forests are instruments of power. Diplomacy is a shifting circle in which a neighboring king is a likely enemy and the neighbor beyond him a possible ally. The text is often compared with Machiavelli because it permits deception and violence. It is broader than a manual for tyranny. The ruler's security depends upon prosperous subjects. In one well-known principle, the king's welfare lies in the welfare of his people. Practical morality and coercion coexist because a ruined countryside cannot support an empire. Chandragupta overthrew the Nandas around the late 4th century BCE and took Pataliputra. He then expanded across northern India and moved into the northwest, where Alexander's successors struggled to retain control. Seleucus I Nicator, one of the most successful successor kings, crossed toward the Indus around 305 BCE. The war ended in agreement. Seleucus ceded territories in the northwest to Chandragupta and received 500 war elephants, which later contributed to his victory in a major battle among the successor kingdoms. A marriage alliance may have formed, though its precise nature is uncertain. A Greek ambassador named Megasthenes lived at the Mauryan court and wrote a work called the Indica. It survives only in quotations and summaries by later authors, some accurate, some confused. He described Pataliputra as a vast city protected by timber walls, towers, and a ditch. He observed officials, markets, soldiers, farmers, philosophers, and social divisions through the expectations of a Greek outsider. His description reminds us that ancient India was already observed through translation. Greek writers tried to fit Indian ascetics into categories such as philosophers. Indian rulers used foreign envoys without becoming Hellenistic kings. Ideas crossed, but they changed shape and movement. The Mauryan Empire did not place one identical administration over every village. Near the center, royal officials could act more directly. Distant regions retained local elites, customs, and tributary relationships. Roads and rivers joined provincial capitals such as Taxila and Ujjain to Pataliputra. The state extracted revenue, maintained troops, and watched routes, but its reach varied. A large standing army was attributed to Chandragupta by ancient observers, including infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. Exact figures are likely exaggerated. The essential fact is scale. No earlier known state had controlled such a broad portion of the subcontinent from the Ganges capital. Elephants embodied imperial power. They could terrify horses, break formations, carry archers, haul loads, and perform in ceremonies. They also required enormous quantities of food and skilled handlers. Forest zones and officers responsible for elephants became strategic resources. The empire rested even more heavily on grain and tax. Farmers responded to monsoon, flood, drought, pests, and local demands. Officials measured land and collected shares. Irrigation works could enlarge harvests. Markets connected surplus to cities and armies. Punishment stood behind assessment, but rulers also had reason to prevent officials from destroying the source of revenue. According to Jain tradition, Chandragupta eventually abdicated, followed the teacher Bhadrabu south, and died through ritual fasting at Shravanabelagala in Karnataka. The story links the founder of an empire to renunciation, a pattern deeply resonant in Indian political imagination. Historical details remain uncertain, but Mauryan connections with regions far south are suggested by inscriptions and later memory. Power passed to his son Bindusara, about whom far less is known. Greek sources called him a Mitricates, probably reflecting a title meaning slayer of foes. He maintained and perhaps expanded the empire, while diplomatic contacts continued with Hellenistic kingdoms. Among his sons was Ashoka. Later Buddhist legends made the prince violently ambitious, physically unattractive, quick to anger, and responsible for killing many brothers before gaining the throne. These stories were written to heighten the contrast between a cruel ruler and a righteous Buddhist king. The succession may indeed have involved struggle, but the dramatic details cannot be accepted without caution. Ashoka took power around 268 BCE. For several years, he ruled as Mauryan kings had ruled before him. Then he turned toward Kalinga. Kalinga occupied the eastern coast between the Mauryan heartland and routes leading toward the south. It possessed ports, fertile land, forests, elephants, and a strong regional identity. Why Ashoka attacked is not recorded. Strategic access, revenue, prestige, and the desire to complete imperial control may all have mattered. The campaign occurred around 261 BCE. The emperor's major rock Edict 13, issued years later, says Kalinga was conquered 8 years after his consecration. It then does something rare in royal inscriptions. It describes the suffering of the defeated and the grief of the victor. People were killed, deported, and separated from relatives and friends. Brahmins, ascetics, householders, and members of different communities suffered. Even those who escaped direct violence were injured by the loss of people they loved. Ashoka declared that this weighed heavily upon him. The words should not be turned into a simple scene in which a warrior sees one battlefield, converts instantly, and never uses force again. Buddhist affiliation may have begun before or developed gradually around the campaign. Ashoka's remorse was expressed within imperial language years later. He continued to threaten forest peoples with punishment if they did not obey. Capital punishment was not abolished. The army remained. Yet the edict still matters. Ancient rulers often lamented defeat, not the suffering caused by their own victory. Ashoka made regret part of kingship and ordered it displayed across the empire. His inscriptions are the first extensive Indian royal words that can be read directly. They appear on natural rock faces, polished sandstone pillars, and cave walls across a territory stretching from present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan through much of India and into Nepal. Some were written in Prakrit languages using Brahmi or Kharosthi scripts. In the northwest, Greek and Aramaic versions addressed communities shaped by earlier Persian and Hellenistic rule. The emperor named himself Devanampiya Payadasi, beloved of the gods, he who looks with affection. For many years, scholars knew the inscriptions before they knew with certainty that Payadasi was Ashoka. The identification emerged through comparison with Sri Lankan chronicles and later discoveries. Reading the edicts in the 19th century restored a ruler who had nearly vanished from historical memory. Stone had preserved what manuscripts and dynasties had not. Ashoka's Dhamma was related to Buddhist ethics, but was not a demand that every subject become Buddhist. The edicts praise respect for parents and elders, generosity toward Brahmins and Shramana, humane treatment of servants, truthfulness, restraint in killing, moderation in ceremony, and tolerance among religious communities. He warned that praising one's own sect while attacking others harms one's own cause. Different traditions should listen to each other. This was not modern secular equality. The emperor defined moral conduct and appointed officials to advance it. Tolerance itself became policy from above. Dhamma Mahamatas, high officers concerned with moral and social welfare, were appointed. They visited communities, prisoners, religious groups, and members of the royal family. Other officials were ordered to tour regularly and explain the king's message. Ashoka wanted moral instruction to move through the administrative network already carrying tax and command. He reduced some forms of animal slaughter and listed species protected on particular occasions. The royal kitchen killed fewer animals than before. Medical provisions were encouraged for humans and animals. Wells, shade trees, and rest facilities were ordered along routes, though the scale of actual construction cannot be measured from aspiration alone. A traveler resting beneath a tree did not need to understand Buddhist philosophy to benefit. A prisoner receiving review of a sentence encountered Dhamma as administration. An animal spared on a designated day encountered it without knowing the word. Ashoka also changed royal ritual. Earlier kings displayed hunts, tours of pleasure, and sacrifice. He described journeys devoted to meeting ascetics, giving gifts, teaching, and observing subjects. He wanted the ruler's movement through the landscape to appear morally useful. This did not remove spectacle. Polished pillars rose with animal capitals of exceptional craftsmanship. Lions, bulls, elephants, and horses connected royal presence with sacred and political meanings. The lion capital from Sarnath, with 4 lions facing outward above a wheel, would become an emblem of modern India more than 2,000 years later. The wheel, Dharmachakra, evoked the Buddha's first teaching and the turning of moral law. Under Ashoka, it could also represent authority radiating in every direction. Religious image and imperial image reinforced each other. Buddhist tradition credits Ashoka with building or opening 84,000 stupas and distributing relics of the Buddha. The number is symbolic. Archaeology does show major patronage and the expansion of stupas associated with the Mauryan and later periods. At Sanchi, Bharhut, and other sites, monuments became centers where donors added railings, gateways, images, and inscriptions over generations. Many donors were not kings. Monks, nuns, merchants, guilds, artisans, families, and women gave pillars or carved panels. A stupa's growth recorded a community of support. Imperial patronage helped, but Buddhism spread through networks larger than one court. Sri Lankan chronicles tell of Ashoka's son Mahinda carrying Buddhism to the island and his daughter Sanghamitra bringing a branch of the Bodhi tree, under which the Buddha had awakened. These accounts were written later and shaped by the island's monastic history, yet close links between the Mauryan world and early Sri Lankan Buddhism are clear. The Bodhi tree at Anuradhapura became a living genealogy. A branch associated with the original tree could root royal legitimacy and sacred memory in new soil. Unlike a stone relic, it grew, required care, and produced descendants. Ashoka's edicts also name Hellenistic kings to the west and speak of Dhamma reaching beyond his borders. Claims of moral conquest should not be confused with proof that organized Buddhist missions converted Mediterranean kingdoms. Contact, however, was real. Envoys, merchants, physicians, and religious specialists moved through routes linking India with Central Asia and the Hellenistic world. Inside the empire, the impact of the edicts varied. A pillar near a major road could speak to officials and travelers. A remote village may never have seen one. Most subjects could not read, so inscriptions required public reading and explanation. The king's voice depended upon local interpreters. Even the language of compassion traveled through hierarchy. An order to be humane was still an order. Ashoka remained deeply concerned with obedience. In Kalinga itself, separate edicts instructed officials to govern impartially and avoid unjust imprisonment or torture. The need to issue these commands suggests abuses were expected. He told administrators that all people were like his children and that he desired welfare for them in this world and the next. A father's care and a father's authority could not be separated. The emperor imagined millions of subjects as dependents whose good he defined. His later reign is poorly documented outside the inscriptions. Buddhist texts tell stories of lavish gifts to the monastic community, conflict within the palace, and decline in royal control. Some depict a final period when ministers limit his generosity. These narratives express moral lessons more clearly than administrative history. Ashoka died around 232 BCE. The empire did not immediately vanish, but succession weakened it. Several short-lived rulers followed. Provinces and frontier regions gained independence. The Northwest faced new powers. The cost of maintaining a vast army and administration may have strained revenue. Local elites who had accepted Mauryan authority under strong rulers had less reason to obey weaker ones. It is tempting to blame Ashoka's nonviolence for imperial collapse, as though remorse made the state soft. The evidence does not support such a simple conclusion. The Mauryan army remained, and most ancient empires struggled after powerful founders. Distance, succession, fiscal pressure, regional diversity, and changing alliances offer more plausible explanations than moral policy alone. Around 185 BCE, the last Mauryan ruler was killed during a military review by his commander Pushyamitra Shunga, who founded a new dynasty in part of northern India. Later Buddhist sources accused Pushyamitra of persecution. Modern historians debate the scale and reliability of those claims. Buddhist institutions continued in many regions, while Brahmanical patronage also grew. The end of Mauryan unity did not return India to an empty age between empires. It released multiple political worlds. In the northwest, Indo-Greek kings ruled territories shaped by Alexander's successors and Indian populations. Their coins carried Greek and local scripts. One king, Menander, became the Milinda of a Buddhist dialogue in which a monk named Nagasena answers questions about identity, rebirth, and the self. The text compares a person to a chariot. A chariot is not identical with its wheels, axle, pole, frame, or any single part, yet the name refers meaningfully to their arrangement. In the same way, a person can exist conventionally without containing an eternal independent essence. A Greek named king and a Buddhist monk became partners in a philosophical work produced by a frontier culture. Other groups entered the northwest: Shakas, often called Scythians, Parthian rulers, and eventually Kushans, whose origins lay among peoples moving from Central Asia. Political change along these routes was not simply invasion from outside. Rulers adopted local languages, gods, titles, coinage, and institutions while maintaining connections beyond the subcontinent. The Kushan Empire, especially under Kanishk in the 2nd century CE, linked northern India with Afghanistan and Central Asia. Caravans passed toward the Silk Roads. Gold coins displayed deities from Iranian, Greek, Indian, and Buddhist worlds. The king's authority appeared comfortable amid plurality. Buddhist communities benefited from these connections. Monks traveled with merchants through oasis towns. Texts were translated. Monasteries offered lodging, credit relationships, education, and trusted networks. Ideas moved not as disembodied wisdom, but with food, money, danger, and language learning. In Gandhara, artists shaped Buddhist subjects through forms influenced by Hellenistic and Roman art. Draped robes, naturalistic bodies, curled hair, architectural frames. In Mathura, sculptors developed other powerful forms from Indian traditions, using red sandstone and different bodily presence. The image of the Buddha as a human figure emerged through several centers rather than one invention. Earlier Buddhist art had often represented his presence through an empty throne, footprints, a wheel, a tree, or a stupa. The move toward bodily images did not simply replace symbols. It created new possibilities for devotion, storytelling, and encounter. A worshipper could now stand before the awakened one's face. South of these northern empires, the Deccan developed its own networks. The Satavahana rulers controlled changing territories across central and western India for centuries. Their power connected inland routes to ports on the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal. They patronized Brahmanical ritual, while Buddhist caves and stupas also flourished. At rock-cut complexes such as Karla, Baja, and later Ajunta, workers carved halls and cells into living stone. Merchants and guilds funded inscriptions. A caravan entering a monsoon refuge could hear chanting beneath a vaulted ceiling shaped to echo wooden architecture. Farther south, Tamil-speaking regions preserved a rich poetic tradition later gathered as Sangam literature. Kings of the Chera, Chola, and Pandya worlds competed, traded, gave gifts, and sought poetic fame. The poems describe war, love, separation, cattle raids, cities, forests, seashores, and the emotional landscapes associated with each environment. Ancient India was never only the Ganges plain. Rivers such as the Narmada, Godavari, Krishna, and Kaveri carried histories that did not wait for northern empires to name them. The sea joined these regions as powerfully as roads did. Sailors learned the seasonal reversal of monsoon winds. In one part of the year, winds could carry ships from the Red Sea and Arabian coast toward western India. Months later, the returning pattern could take them back. Knowledge accumulated among Indian, Arab, African, and other mariners long before Greek and Roman writers recorded it. Ports such as Baragaza, near modern Budoch, Maziris on the Malabar coast, Arachimidu in the southeast, and many smaller harbors connected inland products to ocean routes. Pepper, pearls, ivory, gemstones, cotton textiles, spices, aromatics, and crafted goods moved outward. Gold, silver, wine, glass, coral, and other products moved inward. Roman coins found in southern India do not prove Roman colonies or direct control. They reveal exchange, saving, ornament, bullion, and local reuse. A coin bearing an emperor's face could travel farther than the emperor's authority. It might be melted, pierced, stored, or weighed according to local needs. The first-century maritime guide, known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes ports and commodities from the perspective of a Greek-speaking merchant. It lists rulers, sailing seasons, dangers, and goods with the practical attention of someone whose profit depended upon accuracy. Indian Ocean history becomes visible through this outsider, but local sailors had navigated the same waters through traditions not preserved in comparable texts. Trade enriched courts and guilds, but prosperity was uneven. Dock workers, pack animal drivers, textile workers, farmers, fishers, sailors, moneylenders, and enslaved people carried the system. A luxury bead in a royal necklace contained the labor of miners, drillers, polishers, merchants, and guards along a route extending thousands of kilometers. Guilds organized some crafts and commerce. They could establish rules, receive deposits, lend money, donate to religious institutions, and maintain collective identity across generations. Inscriptions at Buddhist sites often name groups of ivory workers, metal workers, merchants, or caravan leaders as donors. The separation between economic and sacred life was thin. A merchant prayed for safe passage, funded a cave, and gained social honor. A monastery near a route offered stability and relationships. A temple festival created a market. A pilgrimage moved food, cloth, stories, and money with bodies seeking merit. Sacred geography spread across the subcontinent. The Ganges became the most celebrated river, personified as the goddess Ganga descending from heaven. In later myth, her force would have shattered the earth if Shiva had not caught the waters in his matted hair and released them gently. The story joined mountain, river, deity, and human need. Rivers purified because they moved between worlds. They descended from high places, carried ashes, fed crops, and received waste without losing sacred status. Bathing could mark repentance, transition, festival, or preparation. Dying near a sacred river and having ashes placed in its water promised connection with liberation. These meanings developed over long periods. Varanasi, on a bend of the Ganges, became a city of pilgrimage, learning, trade, death, and Shiva. Prayaga, at the confluence of Ganges and Yamuna, gathered ritual importance around meeting waters. Haridwar marked the river's emergence from the Himalayan foothills. No single institution created this map. Epics, Puranic stories, local cults, pilgrimage routes, dynastic patronage, and repeated practice layered sanctity onto place. A village deity could be identified with a wider goddess without losing local character. A mountain sacred to one community could enter a Sanskrit myth. This ability to absorb and reinterpret helped form traditions now grouped under the broad name Hinduism. The word is useful but can mislead when projected backward as one unified ancient religion. Vedic sacrifice, temple devotion, philosophical schools, village practices, ascetic disciplines, household rites, goddess worship, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and many other forms developed through interaction rather than command from one founder. The great Sanskrit epics became central meeting grounds for these traditions. The Mahabharata grew over centuries from heroic poetry into an immense work containing narrative, law, myth, pilgrimage, theology, political reflection, and philosophical debate. It tells of two branches of the Kuru family, the Pandavas and Kauravas, whose rivalry leads to a war at Kurukshetra. The conflict cannot be reduced to heroes against villains. The Pandavas suffer injustice, but they also deceive, gamble, kill, and accept strategies that violate warrior ideals. The Kaurava prince Duryodhana is proud and destructive, yet he commands loyalty. Teachers fight former students. Grandfathers bless men who must attack them. Victory arrives only after almost every family has been broken. The epic repeatedly asks what dharma requires when duties collide. Dharma can mean moral order, law, custom, duty, truth, appropriate conduct, or the pattern sustaining a role and world. A king's duty may conflict with a brother's loyalty. A warrior's duty may conflict with compassion. A wife's obligation may conflict with justice. The epic rarely permits a clean answer without remainder. Its most famous scene occurs before battle. Arjuna stands in his chariot between two armies and recognizes relatives, teachers, and friends on both sides. His bow slips. He refuses to fight. The charioteer Krishna responds in the Bhagavad Gita. He teaches that the embodied self passes through change, that action cannot simply be avoided, and that one should perform rightful duty without attachment to personal reward. Paths of disciplined action, knowledge, meditation, and devotion converge toward the divine. The text has supported very different interpretations. Some read it as a defense of social and warrior duty. Others find a universal teaching of selfless action. Some emphasize devotion to Krishna. Modern political thinkers used it to argue both for resistance and for nonviolence understood as inner detachment. Its power lies partly in refusing to begin from comfort. Philosophy is spoken where every possible action carries grief. The Ramayana follows another pattern. Prince Rama is exiled from Ayodhya because of a promise made by his father. His wife Sita and brother Lakshmana accompany him into the forest. Sita is abducted by Ravana, ruler of Lanka. Rama forms an alliance with forest and monkey heroes, among them Hanuman, crosses to the island, defeats Ravana, and returns to rule. The story offers ideals of loyalty, kingship, courage, devotion, and marital fidelity. It also contains painful questions. Sita's purity is doubted despite her suffering. In some versions, public suspicion leads Rama to send her away while pregnant. Duty to royal reputation destroys private trust. No single Ramayana has owned the story. Sanskrit, Prakrit, Tamil, Bengali, Thai, Khmer, Javanese, Balinese, and many other traditions retold it. Ravana might become more complex. Sita might gain stronger voice. Local landscapes entered the journey. Performers changed emphasis according to audience and age. The spread of the epics through Southeast Asia did not require Indian conquest. Merchants, Brahmins, monks, artisans, diplomats, and marriage ties carried Sanskrit titles, scripts, cosmologies, rituals, and stories. Southeast Asian courts selected and transformed them within local political worlds. A temple in Cambodia or Java is not simply Indian culture copied abroad. It is evidence of creative translation. Within India, epic and Puranic traditions helped reshape relations among gods. Vishnu appeared through avatars such as Rama and Krishna. Shiva joined ascetic stillness, dance, sexuality, destruction, family, and grace. Goddesses appeared as independent powers and as forms of one supreme feminine energy. Bhakti, devotion, offered a relationship with deity through love, surrender, song, image, and memory. Its fuller regional flowering came in later centuries, but ancient foundations were already developing. Devotion could cross some boundaries of learning and ritual access because one did not need mastery of sacrifice to call a divine name. Temples gradually became important centers of worship and economy, though their scale and form varied. Earlier Vedic ritual had not required permanent houses for gods in the same way. Image worship, pilgrimage, offerings, festivals, land grants, and royal patronage created institutions connecting deity, community, and state. A temple employed priests, cooks, musicians, dancers, guards, accountants, artisans, gardeners, and laborers. It received gifts and redistributed food. Its walls told stories. Its calendar organized time. Sacred architecture was never only belief set in stone. It was work and wealth arranged around presence. Buddhist and Jain institutions developed alongside these Brahmanical forms, sometimes competing and often sharing patrons or artistic vocabulary. A ruler might honor several traditions. A merchant family could make donations across sectarian lines. Religious identities were real, but boundaries were not always exclusive. Debate remained vigorous. Buddhist philosophers analyzed perception, language, causation, and emptiness. Jain thinkers developed logic and perspectival reasoning. Brahmanical schools organized inquiry into ritual, grammar, metaphysics, logic, matter, yoga, and liberation. Teachers wrote concise sutras requiring commentary. Then commentators argued over individual words for centuries. Panini's grammar of Sanskrit, probably composed around the middle of the first millennium BCE, reduced language to an astonishingly precise system of rules. Its compact formulations describe sounds, roots, transformations, and exceptions through a formal method that still impresses linguists. Grammar was not merely school exercise. Correct speech preserved sacred authority and offered a model of ordered knowledge. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, compiled at an uncertain date in the early centuries CE or later, described yoga as the calming or restraint of mental fluctuations. Ethical disciplines, bodily posture, breath, withdrawal of senses, concentration, meditation, and absorption formed an eight-limbed path. Modern global yoga often emphasizes physical postures. The ancient text devotes much more attention to mind, suffering, discipline, and liberation. Body was an instrument within a larger psychology. Medical traditions also became systematic. Texts associated with Charaka discussed diagnosis, diet, substances, physicians, and the balance of bodily principles. The surgical tradition associated with Sushruta describes instruments, wounds, procedures, anatomy, and training. These compilations developed over time and contain observation beside theory, practical treatment beside ideas no longer accepted scientifically. A physician approached illness through patient, season, food, environment, and constitution. Medicine was inseparable from philosophy because both asked what a living body is and how balance can be restored. Ordinary people encountered these intellectual worlds unevenly. Most did not read Sanskrit philosophy. They knew stories through performance, ritual, family teaching, local language, art, and festival. A potter might never hear a formal debate about Atman and still participate in a funeral shaped by karma and rebirth. The depth of Indian philosophy did not dissolve social suffering. Landless laborers, enslaved people, debtors, stigmatized communities, and many women lived under constraints defended by custom and law. Texts such as the Dharmashastras prescribed different rights and punishments according to Varna and gender. The Manusmriti, composed over centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, presents a Brahmanical ideal of social hierarchy rather than a complete record of practice. Its very effort to command suggests reality was less obedient than the text desired. Regional law, guild rules, royal orders, family arrangements, and local custom continued to shape life. Women could own certain forms of property, make donations, manage households, become nuns, compose poetry, or exercise royal influence. Yet patriarchal control remained pervasive. Marriage age, inheritance, widowhood, and sexuality were sites of restriction. Ancient India produced visions of universal consciousness and institutions of inherited inequality at the same time. That contradiction cannot be softened by admiration. It also cannot be understood by pretending that one philosophical sentence governed an entire subcontinent. Ideas traveled through societies that accepted, resisted, adapted, and ignored them. The rivers carried sacred promise and human waste together. Purity and pollution were not separated in landscape any more than wisdom and injustice were separated in history. By the 3rd century CE, no empire ruled the entire subcontinent. Kushan power weakened in the northwest. Satavahana territories divided among successors in the Deccan. Regional dynasties controlled river valleys, ports, and interior routes. Political fragmentation did not mean isolation. It meant that several courts competed to define prestige. In the Ganges region, a family called the Guptas began expanding from a modest base. The earliest rulers are dimly known through genealogies and later inscriptions. Chandragupta I, ruling in the early 4th century CE, strengthened his position through marriage to Kumaradevi of the Lichavi lineage. Coins displayed husband and wife together, making alliance visible in gold. Their son Samudragupta transformed the dynasty. An inscription carved on an older Ashokan pillar at Prayaga praises his campaigns in elaborate Sanskrit. The location itself layered power, a Mauryan monument bearing the words of a later conqueror at a sacred confluence. Ashoka's polished stone had once announced Dhamma. Samudragupta's poet announced victory, generosity, learning, and royal excellence. The inscription lists rulers defeated in the Ganges plain, forest chiefs subdued, kings of the south captured and released, frontier states offering tribute, and distant powers seeking friendship. It is praise, not neutral record. Its geography still reveals a flexible imperial strategy. Some territories were annexed. Others were restored to rulers who acknowledged Gupta superiority. Southern expeditions displayed reach without attempting permanent occupation of every region. Border kingdoms and republics paid or sent embassies. Empire existed in degrees. Samudragupta also presented himself as poet and musician. Coins show him playing a stringed instrument, probably a veena. The image combined warrior, patron, and cultivated king. Conquest alone was no longer sufficient for universal rule. The ruler should master Sanskrit culture and sacred generosity. The title, often translated as King of Kings, linked Gupta authority to broader Eurasian traditions. Horse sacrifice linked it to Vedic sovereignty. Samudragupta performed the Ashvamedha, releasing a consecrated horse to wander under military protection. Any ruler who stopped it challenged the sponsor. Its successful return justified a grand sacrifice and announced supremacy. A ritual described in ancient texts had become imperial theater in a transformed world. Coins commemorated the horse. Brahmins received gifts. Sanskrit poets placed the dynasty inside sacred history. The Guptas did not recreate the centralized Mauryan state. Their administration depended more heavily upon local rulers, feudatories, guilds, landholders, and hereditary officials. Grants of land and revenue to Brahmins or religious institutions expanded. Documents sometimes transferred rights over taxes, labor, and local resources. Such grants supported learning, ritual, and settlement. They could also reduce direct royal revenue and increase the power of intermediaries over cultivators. The celebrated court existed above villages where obligations were changing. Samudragupta's successor, Chandragupta II, later associated with the title Vikramaditya, extended influence westward and defeated Western Kshatrapa rulers. Control of routes toward Gujarat and the Arabian Sea strengthened access to trade. Ujjain became an important center alongside Pataliputra. Gold coins from the period display kings as archers, horsemen, lion slayers, sacrificers, and patrons. Their fine workmanship is evidence of wealth and communication, but not proof that prosperity reached everyone. A gold coin is most visible where elites, soldiers, merchants, and tax systems concentrate value. The Gupta political order was strongest across much of northern India, not a unified empire covering all of modern India. Powerful dynasties continued in the Deccan and south. The Vakatakas, for example, ruled important regions and formed marriage alliances with the Guptas. A Gupta princess, Prabhavati Gupta, became queen and later regent in the Vakataka realm. Her inscriptions show a woman exercising dynastic authority through widowhood, lineage, and motherhood. She ruled within a patriarchal system but was not politically invisible. Marriage connected courts more effectively than direct annexation could. During the reign of Chandragupta II, a Buddhist monk from China named Faxian traveled through India. He had crossed deserts and mountains in search of authoritative monastic texts and disciplinary rules. His account describes monasteries, pilgrimage sites, cities, social practices, and the difficulties of travel. Faxian admired parts of the Ganges plain, reporting mild government and limited corporal punishment in some regions. His observations have sometimes been used to paint the Gupta age as universally peaceful and prosperous. He traveled as a Buddhist pilgrim with specific interests, relied on hosts, and did not survey every community. His silences are not statistics. He also described people treated as outcasts, required to live apart, and signal their presence when entering towns. The same account that praises order reveals exclusion. Pilgrims such as Faxian connected India to a widening Buddhist world. They sought manuscripts, visited Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, Kushanagara, and other sites, learned languages, and carried texts back across Central Asia or by sea. Translation became a religious act requiring choices about terms that had no exact equivalence. A Sanskrit or Prakrit word could enter Chinese through transcription, analogy, or newly created vocabulary. Concepts such as karma, nirvana, emptiness, and bodhisattva changed the languages receiving them. Indian Buddhism itself changed through contact with Central Asian, Chinese, and Southeast Asian traditions. Within India, Mahayana forms had developed alongside older schools. Bodhisattvas embodied the aspiration to achieve awakening for the benefit of all beings. Devotion, merit transfer, elaborate cosmologies, and new sutras expanded religious imagination. These developments were diverse and gradual, not one council declaring a new religion. Buddhist monasteries could become large landholding and educational centers. Nalanda, which flourished most famously after the Gupta period, grew in the Ganges region into an institution attracting students from across Asia. Its later prominence had roots in long traditions of monastic learning and royal support. Brahmanical traditions also expanded through Sanskrit and temple networks. The Puranas gathered cosmology, genealogies, pilgrimage geography, myths, and instructions in texts revised over centuries. They organized time on immense scales, ages of the world rising and declining, universes created and dissolved, dynasties placed within cosmic rhythm. A human lifetime became a brief moment inside cycles almost beyond number. This cosmic scale did not remove attention from local place. Puranic texts named rivers, mountains, forests, and cities as sacred. They allowed regional deities and traditions to enter broader frameworks. A goddess worshipped at one hill could be a manifestation of Devi. A local hero could become associated with Shiva or Vishnu. Sanskrit served as a prestige language across courts and religious traditions. It had long been sacred and scholarly. Under the Guptas and other dynasties, it became increasingly prominent in political inscriptions. Rulers far from the Ganges used it to communicate participation in a trans-regional culture. This Sanskrit cosmopolis did not erase local languages. Prakrit, Tamil, and many other spoken forms continued. Literature and inscriptions moved between them. Elite language could unite courts while separating educated specialists from most subjects. The Gupta period is often called a golden age because of achievements in literature, art, mathematics, astronomy, and religious architecture. The phrase captures real brilliance. It also raises a necessary question. Golden for whom? A court poet, successful merchant, Brahmin recipient of land, or master craftsman might experience opportunity. A peasant facing rent, tax, and compulsory labor might see another side. A woman's options depended upon family and status. A community placed outside caste respectability did not enter a golden age because a king issued a beautiful coin. Historical periods do not have one color. Still, the intellectual and artistic work of these centuries deserves attention without requiring myth. It emerged not from effortless peace but from institutions, patrons, teachers, debate, trade, and generations of accumulated knowledge. In the city of Kusamapura, often identified with Pataliputra, a young scholar composed a dense Sanskrit work in 499 CE. He stated his age as 23. His name was Aryabhata. Aryabhata's Aryabhatiya is remarkably short for the influence it carried. Written in compressed verse suited to memorization, it summarizes arithmetic, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calendrical calculation, and astronomy. A teacher had to unpack each line through explanation and commentary. He gave an approximation of pi accurate to several decimal places and indicated that it was an approximation rather than an exact value. He developed tables of signs, replacing the Greek geometrical chord with a function more useful for calculation. He described methods for extracting roots and solving classes of equations. His astronomy placed the Earth at the center of a celestial system in important respects, so it should not be turned into a modern heliocentric theory. Yet he made a striking claim. The apparent daily motion of the stars results from the Earth rotating on its axis, like stationary objects appearing to move backward to someone traveling in a boat. This explanation opposed the intuition that the heavens physically circle a fixed Earth each day. Later Indian astronomers debated it. Some adopted his calculations while rejecting rotation. Intellectual influence did not require complete agreement. Aryabhata explained eclipses through shadows rather than a mythic being swallowing the sun or moon. Myth and mathematical astronomy could coexist because they answered different ritual and technical needs. An almanac maker needed to predict the event even when a story gave it sacred meaning. Observation, inherited models, and computation formed a continuous tradition. Astronomers required calendars to determine ritual dates, seasons, planetary positions, and eclipses. Courts valued prediction. Merchants and farmers cared about time. Mathematics grew within social demand as well as abstract curiosity. The Indian place-value decimal system developed over centuries, not in one sudden Gupta invention. Earlier numeral forms represented numbers in different ways. By the classical period, a digit's position could determine units, tens, hundreds, and beyond. This made large calculation far more efficient. Zero also has a history rather than one birthday. A blank place had to be distinguished from no number written. A symbol for an empty position emerged in Indian notation. The full arithmetic treatment of zero as a number became clearer later, especially in the work of Brahmagupta in 628 CE. after the main Gupta age. He set rules for addition and subtraction involving zero, though division by zero remained unresolved. The achievement was collective and cumulative. Its later transmission through scholars writing in Arabic gave Europe what it called Hindu Arabic numerals. The word algorithm came through the Latinized name of al-Khwarizmi, whose work explained Indian calculation. The word algebra came from an Arabic title. Civilizations did not pass knowledge like sealed boxes. They translated and transformed it. Every modern account, measurement, scientific formula, and digital process relies upon positional notation and zeros so thoroughly that their strangeness has disappeared. A child writing 205 uses an idea requiring the middle position to mean something even though it holds nothing. Ancient Indian thinkers made absence count. Other scholars built upon astronomy and mathematics. Varahamihara, active in the 6th century, synthesized Indian and Greco-Roman astronomical traditions and wrote on omens, architecture, weather, planetary science, and many aspects of learned culture. His work shows that foreign origin did not prevent knowledge from becoming Indian through use. Medicine, logic, grammar, and philosophy also continued through networks of commentary. The most influential intellectual labor was often not producing a completely new doctrine, but explaining an old sentence more precisely than previous teachers had. Commentary created conversation across centuries. Literature offered another form of continuity. Kalidasa, usually placed around the Gupta age though his exact date and court remain uncertain, became the most celebrated poet and dramatist of classical Sanskrit. His play Shakuntala tells of a king who meets a young woman raised in a forest hermitage. They fall in love and marry in secret. A curse causes him to forget her until a lost ring restores recognition. Their separation, her vulnerability at court, and eventual reunion join romance with questions of memory, legitimacy, and royal duty. The plot draws upon a story in the Mahabharata but transforms it. Nature responds to emotion. Trees seem to farewell Shakuntala when she leaves the hermitage. Bees, deer, seasons, and rivers are not background decoration. They participate in human feeling. Kalidasa's Meghaduta, the cloud messenger, begins with an exiled being asking a monsoon cloud to carry a message to his distant wife. The imagined route crosses central India toward the Himalayas, turning geography into longing. Rivers, cities, mountains, flowering trees, and rain become a map traced by separation. The monsoon that shaped agriculture and sailing also became a messenger in poetry. Sanskrit drama combined spoken language, music, gesture, costume, and social distinction. High-status male characters often spoke Sanskrit, while women and other characters used Prakrit forms according to theatrical convention. The stage reproduced hierarchy even as powerful female characters carried emotional action. Audiences already knew many stories. Pleasure came from recognition, variation, performance, and rasa, the cultivated emotional flavor of an artistic experience. Love, courage, sorrow, laughter, wonder, fear, disgust, anger, and tranquility could be shaped through art rather than merely represented. Visual artists pursued their own transformations. Gupta sculpture gave divine and awakened bodies a controlled balance, soft modeling, and inward calm. Images of the Buddha from Sarnath appear almost weightless beneath thin robes, faces lowered into concentration. Hindu deities gained increasingly standardized forms through which worshippers could recognize attributes and stories. An image was not merely an illustration. Through consecration and ritual, it could become a focus of divine presence. The worshipper offered water, light, flowers, fragrance, food, and attention. Darshan meant seeing and being seen by the deity. Temples began developing forms that later Indian architecture would elaborate enormously. A sanctuary housed the image. Doorways marked transition. Towers rose over sacred centers. Narrative panels placed myth around the devotees' movement. The surviving monuments are only fragments. Wood, paint, cloth, and ordinary shrines vanished more easily than stone. Archaeology favors what endured, not necessarily what most people saw daily. Cave sites preserve richer worlds. At Ajunta, in the Deccan under Vakataka patronage, excavators carved monasteries and worship halls into cliffs above a river gorge. Painters covered walls with scenes from the Buddha's former lives, courtly processions, forests, merchants, animals, grief, generosity, temptation, and compassion. Lamplight would have made figures appear and recede across painted surfaces. Monks lived among images of luxury while practicing detachment. Donors gained merit by financing beauty. Art linked renunciation to wealth again. The famous iron pillar, now standing in Delhi, demonstrates another technical tradition. Produced around the Gupta period, it contains a Sanskrit inscription praising a king commonly identified with Chandragupta II. Its large forged iron mass and resistance to severe corrosion reflect sophisticated metalworking and environmental chemistry, not magic. Metalworkers rarely appear by name in royal inscriptions. Their skill supports royal immortality while their identities disappear. Life beyond courts and monasteries continued through villages. Most people worked in agriculture. The rhythm of plowing, sowing, transplanting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, and storing followed local crops and rainfall. Rice dominated many wetter regions. Wheat and barley remained important elsewhere. Millets supported drier zones. Sugarcane, cotton, pulses, sesame, fruits, and spices entered varied economies. The monsoon could bring abundance or ruin. Too little rain withered fields. Too much destroyed embankments and houses. A ruler praised for prosperity depended upon clouds he could not command. Irrigation tanks, wells, canals, and local waterworks reduced risk. Building and maintaining them required collective labor and authority. Inscriptions sometimes celebrate rulers or donors who repaired dams. The most meaningful imperial act for a farming community might be a reservoir that held through summer. Villages were not isolated timeless units. They paid taxes, supplied labor, visited markets, sent sons to armies or monasteries, and received wandering performers, ascetics, officials, and traders. Local councils and headmen mediated demands. Land grants could place new recipients between cultivator and king. Urban life varied from monumental capitals to market towns. Streets held potters, metalworkers, oil pressers, weavers, perfumers, jewelers, scribes, food sellers, entertainers, physicians, courtesans, monks, beggars, animals, and carts. Occupational communities passed skills through families, but also responded to demand and migration. Textiles were among India's most important products. Spinning and weaving often depended heavily upon women's labor, whether in households or organized production. Fine cotton could travel across oceans while the hands making it remained unrecorded. The Kama Sutra, attributed to Vatsyayana and composed in the early centuries CE, belongs to an urban elite world. Its modern reputation reduces it to sexual positions, which form only part of the work. It discusses courtship, marriage, pleasure, household arrangement, courtesans, social skills, music, games, poetry, perfumes, and the cultivated arts. It also assumes inequality, male privilege, servants, wealth, and social categories. It is evidence for ideals and anxieties, not a guide to how every Indian lived. Courtesans in such texts could be educated, financially strategic, and socially visible while remaining vulnerable to exploitation. Elite women could influence households and courts but faced control over marriage and sexuality. Religious renunciation offered some an alternative, Yet monasteries also imposed gender hierarchy. No golden age removed the ordinary negotiations of survival. At court, poets praised universal rulers. In fields, people watched the sky. The Gupta order began weakening during the 5th century. Chandragupta, one of the last powerful rulers of the dynasty, celebrated victories over enemies and repaired the Great Sudarshana Reservoir in western India after damage. His inscriptions present a king protecting inherited order through effort, not enjoying effortless abundance. Pressure came from several directions. Groups known in Indian sources as Hunas entered through the northwest, connected with wider movements across Central Asia. They were not identical in every respect to the Huns who had followed Attila in Europe, though ancient and modern labels often blur them. Their attacks damaged frontier systems and demanded expensive defense. Internal succession disputes, the growing independence of regional governors and feudatories, changing trade patterns, and reduced access to revenue also weakened central power. Land grants that had helped rulers reward allies and religious institutions could transfer resources away from the court. No single invasion explains the decline. By the early 6th century, Gupta authority had fragmented. Huna rulers such as Toramana and Mihirakula controlled parts of northern and central India for a time. Later Buddhist accounts remembered Mihirakula as a persecutor of exceptional cruelty, while inscriptions reveal political claims and alliances more difficult than a simple villain story. Regional rulers eventually defeated or displaced Huna power. The subcontinent again became a field of several states. Gupta artistic, administrative, religious, and literary forms continued because political collapse does not erase habits all at once. The dynasties end also exposes the problem with imagining ancient Indian history as a sequence of northern empires. While the Guptas rose and declined, Pallava rulers developed power in the southeast. Kadambas, Vakatakas, and other dynasties governed the Deccan. Tamil polities maintained their own traditions. Sri Lanka followed its own royal and monastic histories while remaining tied to the mainland. A map centered only on Pataliputra makes most lives peripheral. The rivers themselves resist that map. The Narmada runs west through central India. The Godavari and Krishna cross the Deccan toward the Bay of Bengal. The Kaveri waters the Tamil country. Each river supported settlements, shrines, routes, languages, and political ambitions. Sacred India was a network, not a single valley expanding to contain all others. Southern courts adopted Sanskrit titles and Brahmanical rituals while patronizing local languages and deities. Buddhist and Jain communities also flourished. The process, sometimes called Indianization in Southeast Asia, similarly involved selective adoption rather than one-way cultural conquest. Across the Bay of Bengal, rulers and merchants used Sanskrit inscriptions, Indian scripts, concepts of kingship, Hindu deities, Buddhist teachings, and epic stories. These arrived through maritime relationships linking eastern India and the Tamil coasts with Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Malay Peninsula, and the Indonesian archipelago. Local societies did not become copies of India. They combined imported ideas with ancestral cults, existing trade systems, local languages, and regional political needs. A Sanskrit royal title could strengthen a Cambodian king. A Buddhist monument in Java could express a cosmology through architecture unknown in India. The Ramayana could intertie dance and change its characters. Ideas survived by becoming local. Buddhism's history demonstrates this principle especially clearly. From India, it traveled through multiple routes and divided into many traditions. In Sri Lanka, Theravada lineages preserved a Pali canon and monastic institutions. Across Central Asia, manuscripts and paintings appeared in oasis communities. In China, translators debated how to render Indian concepts into a language with different philosophical assumptions. Some Chinese readers understood nirvana through Taoist vocabulary before later translators refined distinctions. Meditation methods, devotional practices, monastic rules, cosmology, and philosophy entered conversation with Confucian family ethics and Chinese statecraft. Buddhism would later decline across much of India while becoming deeply rooted elsewhere. The religion did not fail because it traveled. Its movement was one of its greatest forms of continuity. Hindu traditions traveled differently, often through courts, merchants, Brahmins, and stories rather than large missionary orders. Sanskrit functioned as a language of prestige. Temple architecture and divine kingship helped rulers place their states within cosmic order. Yet Southeast Asian societies never surrendered authorship of what they received. The same was true westward. Indian numerals and astronomical methods entered scholarly networks writing in Arabic. Persian and Arab merchants participated in Indian Ocean exchange. Indian medicine and fables traveled through translation. The Sanskrit collection known as the Panchatantra, a series of animal stories about political wisdom, friendship, betrayal, and survival, moved into Middle Persian, Arabic, and many later languages. Under the Arabic title Kalila wa Dimna, its jackals and kings entered courts far from the forests of the original. A story can cross a border more easily than an army and remain active longer. Ancient India's influence was therefore not one empire spreading outward from one capital. It was a repeated pattern of circulation. Merchants carried goods and religious donations. Monks carried texts and relics. Brahmins carried ritual knowledge. Artisans carried forms. Sailors carried route memory. Translators carried concepts across languages. The subcontinent received as well as gave. Greek astronomy, Central Asian artistic forms, Iranian titles, foreign coins, new crops, and migrating peoples became parts of Indian history. Purity was often a claim made after mixture had already occurred. Even Sanskrit, preserved as a language of authority, flourished through encounter. Grammar guarded form while poets used it for new worlds. Buddhism adopted languages beyond its birthplace. Tamil literature asserted landscapes and emotions with traditions not reducible to northern models. The word India itself comes through a river. The Sanskrit sent the name the Indus and could mean river. Persian speech transformed the initial sound. Greek writers called the land beyond it India. A name applied from the northwest gradually came to describe an entire subcontinent whose people did not share one ancient political identity. Later traditions used Bharatavarsha, the land of Bharata, in cosmology and sacred geography. Modern India would inherit both names and many arguments about what they should mean. Ancient history does not provide one pure answer to modern identity. It provides evidence of depth, diversity, movement, hierarchy, conflict, and invention. The Indus cities cannot be assigned simply to one later religion or language because their script remains silent. Vedic culture cannot be reduced to modern race. Ashoka cannot be made only a pacifist saint or only an imperial propagandist. The Gupta age cannot be praised without asking who paid for its order. The past becomes smaller when used only to confirm the present. It becomes more powerful when allowed to remain difficult. Imagine a traveler arriving at a center of learning during the late ancient period. He does not enter a university in the modern sense. He finds monasteries, temples, teachers' houses, libraries, debate halls, gardens, kitchens, wells, and lodging supported by gifts. Students come with different preparation. Some have memorized grammar before studying logic. Some seek monastic discipline. Some hope that mastery of a text will bring patronage at court. A lesson begins with recitation. The teacher gives a compact rule. Students repeat it, ask about exceptions, and listen to earlier interpretations. Writing assists memory, but disciplined hearing remains central. Palm leaf or birch bark manuscripts are fragile. They must be recopied before insects, moisture, fire, and handling destroy them. The survival of a work depends upon communities deciding it is worth copying. Countless texts disappear because one line of teachers ends, one monastery burns, one language loses readers, or one patron chooses another school. Debate trains attention. A claim must be stated. Terms must be defined. Evidence must be recognized by both sides. An opponent's position should be represented before being refuted. Indian traditions developed elaborate theories of valid knowledge, perception, inference, reliable testimony, comparison, implication, and absence were accepted in different combinations. The Nyaya school examined logic, language, error, and proof. It asked how a person knows that smoke indicates fire and what conditions make inference valid. Vaisheshika thinkers classified reality into substances, qualities, motion, universals, particularity, and inherence, and developed forms of atomism. Samkhya described experience through a distinction between consciousness, purusha, and material nature, prakriti. Nature unfolds into intellect, ego, senses, subtle elements, and the visible world. Liberation comes when consciousness recognizes that it is not the changing process it observes. Yoga drew upon related analysis while emphasizing disciplined practice. Mimamsa defended the authority and interpretation of Vedic ritual. Vedanta developed from the Upanishads and would later divide into several powerful accounts of the relation between self, world, and ultimate reality. Buddhist schools rejected a permanent creator and enduring self while disagreeing among themselves about what exists from moment to moment. Nagarjuna, associated with the Madhyamaka tradition around the 2nd or 3rd century CE, argued that things lack independent inherent existence because they arise through dependence. Emptiness did not mean that nothing matters. It meant that no object, person, idea, or identity exists entirely from its own side, untouched by causes and relations. Even emptiness itself must not become another absolute substance. Other Buddhist philosophers analyzed streams of momentary experience or developed idealist accounts of consciousness. Monastic debate could become intensely technical because liberation was thought to depend upon seeing error precisely. Jain philosophers answered with their doctrine of many-sided reality. A clay pot exists in one respect, changes in another, and can be described differently according to standpoint. No single ordinary assertion captures the whole. The lesson encouraged intellectual caution while preserving a world of enduring souls. These schools disagreed about nearly everything, whether a self exists, whether Vedic testimony is authoritative, whether the world is composed of atoms, whether a god is necessary, what continues through rebirth, and how liberation occurs. Their coexistence refutes the image of ancient India as a civilization satisfied with one mystical answer. It was a civilization in which arguments about consciousness, language, ethics, and reality became institutions. Yet philosophical freedom had boundaries. A debate normally occurred among people with education, leisure, and access. The farmer supplying grain to a monastery supported questions he might never be invited to discuss. A low-status worker could be told that birth reflected past karma, turning a theory of moral causation into justification for present inequality. Karma could also undermine inherited privilege. Buddhist and Jain teachers insisted that action, not birth, determines spiritual progress. Devotional movements could place intense personal relation to a deity above ritual rank. Stories repeatedly made wise hunters, devoted women, forest people, or outcasts morally superior to proud elites. Tradition contained tools both for hierarchy and for criticism. The sacred river carried the same double power. At dawn in Varanasi, a wealthy patron could descend broad steps accompanied by servants and a priest. Nearby, A widow might offer a small lamp because it was all she possessed. Boatmen waited for passengers. Washer communities worked along the water. Funeral pyres burned. Children played. Ascetics covered in ash watched the light. The river did not make these lives equal. It placed them within one current. Water taken in a small vessel might travel to a distant household altar. Ashes released after cremation entered a flow believed to connect death with liberation. Pilgrims carried stories home, making sacred geography present in places they had left. The Ganges was not always gentle. Floods erased houses, fields, ghats, and paths. Channels shifted. Disease traveled through water. Sacred status did not suspend ecology. Communities rebuilt because danger and blessing came from the same source. In the northwest, the Indus continued through landscapes that had held Harappan cities and later armies. In the south, the Kaveri's branching delta supported rice agriculture and temples. The Nirmada became a pilgrimage route in which devotees walked the river's length. The Godavari was praised as a southern Ganges. Calling one river by the sacred name of another did not reduce regional difference. It created kinship among waters. Rivers also defined political ambition. A king who crossed one entered another realm. An inscription placed at a confluence addressed travelers and gods. Armies depended upon ford, ferry, bridge, and season. Capitals rose where waterways met because transport made taxation possible. The Mauryas governed from the Ganges. The Satavahanas moved across Deccan routes. Gupta power displayed itself at Prayaga. Kalinga's independence mattered because its coast connected inland rivers with the sea. Philosophy and empire were never separate subjects. The ability to renounce depended upon surplus. The ability to inscribe remorse depended upon conquest. The ability to debate liberation depended upon institutions that collected food. The ability to build a sacred monument depended upon labor. Ashoka's pillar and a peasant's field belonged to the same political world, even when the inscription spoke only in the emperor's voice. This connection makes his confession after Kalinga more complicated and more valuable. He could regret suffering because royal power had caused it. He could spread the regret because royal power still existed. Dhamma did not replace empire. It became empire reflecting upon itself. The reflection did not prevent later war. The Mauryas fell. New rulers conquered. Ashoka's name faded. Many pillars were damaged, moved, reused, or misunderstood. People living near them created new stories about who had raised the impossible stone. Some called them the staffs of legendary heroes. The letters remained visible after the language of their authority was forgotten. For more than 1,000 years, the Brahmi script of Ashoka's inscriptions could no longer be read. Later Indian scripts descended from Brahmi through changing forms, but knowledge of the ancient letters was not preserved as a continuous key. Pillars remained in landscapes and cities. Medieval rulers moved some of them. Visitors copied marks without understanding the voice behind them. During the 19th century, scholars working within British colonial institutions collected coins and inscriptions from across the subcontinent. Their work depended heavily upon Indian assistants, pundits, draftsmen, excavators, informants, and local knowledge, much of which entered publications without equal recognition. James Prinsep compared repeated groups of letters on coins and inscriptions and deciphered Brahmi in the 1830s. A formula naming the beloved of the gods, Payadasi, became readable. Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicles helped connect that royal title with Ashoka. The emperor returned first not as legend, but as a pattern in stone. His words complicated colonial ideas that India possessed religion, but no history or political ethics. Here was a ruler speaking across provinces, naming foreign kings, regulating administration, and reflecting upon violence centuries before the Roman Empire reached its height. Modern Indian nationalism later claimed Ashoka as a model of unity, tolerance, and moral government. The lion capital at Sarnath became the state emblem. The wheel entered the national flag. These choices did not merely recover the past. They selected a past useful to a new republic. The Guptas, too, were shaped by modern memory. The phrase Golden Age celebrated artistic and scientific achievement and offered an answer to colonial claims of stagnation. It also encouraged simplified pictures of unity, prosperity, and religious harmony. Later scholarship asked more closely about land grants, regional variation, caste, gender, and the lives missing from court poetry. Every recovery creates another layer. The Indus civilization returned even later. In the 19th century, ancient bricks from Harappa were removed for railway ballast before the site's significance was understood. Archaeological surveys eventually recognized seals and mounds unlike known historical remains. In the 1920s, announcements about Harappa and Mohenjo-daro revealed an urban civilization older than the Vedas. The discovery transformed the chronology of South Asia. Cities, drains, standardized weights, and long-distance trade had flourished more than 4,000 years earlier. India's urban past no longer began with the Ganges kingdoms or Mauryan state. Excavation also occurred within colonial structures that divided objects among museums and often treated ruins as possessions of scholarship rather than places connected to living communities. The partition of British India in 1947 placed major Indus sites within Pakistan, while many related settlements lay in India. Modern borders cut across an ancient cultural zone that had known neither nation-state. Archaeologists in both countries continued discovering sites and revising interpretations. Dholavira revealed large reservoirs and stone construction adapted to scarcity. Rakhigarhi expanded understanding of settlement scale in Haryana. Coastal and inland finds showed that the civilization could not be reduced to two cities along one river. The undeciphered script remains an invitation and a warning. Claims of solution appear regularly. Some assign the signs to Sanskrit, Dravidian, or another language and use the result to support modern identity. Without a long bilingual text or a method convincing across the corpus, certainty remains premature. The people of the Indus should not be forced to speak words chosen by descendants who cannot hear them. Their silence has value. It protects complexity against easy ownership. Ancient DNA and archaeology have added information about population history, but genes do not carry language, religion, or civilization in simple packages. Human ancestry in South Asia reflects many layers of deep local continuity and migration. Later communities emerged through mixture rather than isolated purity. The study of Indo-Aryan migration remains politically charged because ancient language has been asked to justify modern belonging. Evidence supports movement from steppe-related populations into South Asia during the second millennium BCE and interaction with existing peoples. It does not support racial hierarchies or the idea that one modern community owns the Vedas biologically. Culture is learned, adapted, and transmitted. The Rigveda survived through teachers and students, not chromosomes. The modern study of Buddhism produced similar distortions. European interpreters sometimes celebrated it as rational philosophy while dismissing ritual and devotion practiced by Asian communities. Hindu traditions were either romanticized as timeless mysticism or reduced to caste and superstition. Jainism was treated as a minor variation despite its distinctive history. Ancient India becomes more accurate when no tradition is used merely as a mirror for foreign expectation. It also becomes more human when achievements are returned to labor. The decimal system was not a flash of mystical genius detached from schools of astronomy. Ashoka's pillars required quarry workers, transport crews, polishers, scribes, and local officials. Gupta sculpture required stone, tools, apprenticeship, and patrons. A manuscript required leaves prepared, lines ruled, ink mixed, and copies protected from rain. Civilization is made from repeated care. That care continues around sacred rivers under new pressures. The Ganges still supports hundreds of millions of people across its basin. It remains a goddess, water source, transport route, agricultural system, sewer, political symbol, and site of death. Dams, pollution, climate change, melting glaciers, industrial waste, sewage, and extraction place ancient sacred language beside modern ecological crisis. To call a river pure does not keep it clean. Religious groups, scientists, governments, local communities, and activists argue over responsibility. The ancient insight that water binds life together becomes practical rather than poetic. What happens upstream reaches someone downstream. The Indus is divided by international borders and managed through treaties in a region facing population growth and climatic stress. Harappan reservoirs at Dholavira now appear not as evidence that ancient people had solved water forever, but that survival in uncertain landscapes has always required foresight. Monsoon still shapes expectation. Satellites now track clouds that poets once addressed as messengers. Forecasts reach phones. Farmers still wait. The philosophical questions also remain active, though never unchanged. Buddhist meditation has entered global medicine, psychology, and popular culture, sometimes separated from ethics and community. Yoga has become physical exercise for millions, while ancient traditions continue treating it as a path of disciplined transformation. The Bhagavad Gita is read by devotees, philosophers, soldiers, pacifists, and political leaders who disagree about its demand. Zero passes through every computer calculation without announcing its Indian history. The epics move through television, comics, village performance, dance, political speech, scholarship, and family storytelling. Their characters remain morally powerful because they are not simple. Arjuna still hesitates. Sita still raises questions about duty and injustice. Hanuman still embodies devotion. Draupadi still asks how a court can call itself righteous while humiliating her. A living tradition is not one that repeats without change. It is one that continues producing argument. Ancient India has sometimes been praised as uniquely spiritual, as though people beside the Ganges cared only for liberation while other civilizations built states and markets. The record shows something more interesting. Indian societies built cities, collected taxes, fought wars, traded across oceans, enforced hierarchy, developed law, and pursued wealth. They also placed radical questions about desire and selfhood at the center of intellectual life. Material ambition and renunciation faced each other across the same road. A king sent troops toward Kalinga. A monk walked away from property. A merchant funded a stupa. A Brahmin preserved a hymn. A woman asked whether wealth could make her immortal. A mathematician used verse to compress calculation. A craft worker shaped a lion that later represented a nation. No one moment contains the whole. The title Ancient India may suggest one object waiting to be described. What existed was a succession of connected worlds. Harappan cities without readable voices, Vedic communities preserving voice without city writing, Ganges kingdoms, renunciant movements, Mauryan administration, regional trade networks, Kushan frontiers, Tamil poetry, Gupta courts, monasteries, villages, ports, forests, and sacred places. Their continuities are real, but so are their breaks. The Indus script disappeared. Vedic Sanskrit ceased to be ordinary speech. Buddhism declined in much of its birthplace. Empires fragmented. Cities shifted with rivers. Political centers moved. What endured did so through transformation. Return now to Kalinga after the Mauryan army has passed. The fields do not know that the campaign will become a moral turning point in royal history. They know only absence. Some houses are empty. Some captives are already moving toward distant destinations. Survivors search for relatives, rebuild walls, count animals, and decide whether the next season can still be planted. Ashoka's remorse does not restore the dead. That is why his later proclamation refuses an easy celebration. Its greatness lies not in proving that an emperor became pure, but in allowing power to record that victory can be guilt. The conqueror cannot undo the march. He can only decide what the memory of it will demand next. Years later, workers cut that confession into stone far from the battlefield, including at Khalsi below the Himalayan foothills. In Kalinga itself, at Dhali and Magadha, the great edict describing the slaughter was omitted. Separate commands addressed local officials instead, demanding restraint, impartial justice, and concern for people the empire had only recently conquered. The difference is revealing. Ashoka proclaimed remorse across the wider realm while speaking to Kalinga through the language of government. At Khalsi, most people who pass cannot read the inscription for themselves. Someone speaks the message aloud. The emperor says that he now desires moral conquest. He says that the grief of conquered people weighs upon him. He says that different sects should respect one another. He says that subjects are like his children. A subject hearing the words may believe him, doubt him, or think first about tax and harvest. Water continues through the landscape beside them. Upstream, water has crossed hills older than every dynasty. Downstream, the rivers of the foothills join the Yamuna and the wider Ganges world. The inscription carries the memory of a distant eastern conquest into another landscape, just as imperial roads and messengers once carried orders beyond the horizon. Rivers made ancient Indian civilization possible, but they also resisted ownership. Kings claimed banks, crossings, and confluences. Poets made waters divine. Pilgrims carried them in vessels. Farmers diverted them. Cities polluted them. Floods ignored them all. The Indus held cities whose language disappeared. The Ganges held kingdoms that transformed sacrifice, philosophy, and empire. The Nirmada, Godavari, Krishna, and Kaveri held histories too often placed outside a northern story. The sea received every river and opened routes beyond the subcontinent. Along those routes moved cotton and pepper, but also forms of thought. Buddhism crossed mountains and oceans. Sanskrit epics entered new languages. Numerals passed into Arabic scholarship and then farther west. Indian astronomy received Greek ideas and returned altered systems to later worlds. No civilization gives without receiving. This is the deeper meaning of continuity. It is not an untouched inheritance carried safely through time. It is a sequence of translations. The Harappan brick becomes an archaeological measurement. The Vedic hymn becomes a recitation preserved after its spoken language changes. The Buddhist teaching becomes many Buddhisms. Ashoka's lion becomes a modern emblem. The empty place in a number becomes zero, then a foundation of machines no ancient mathematician could imagine. The Gita becomes a new answer each time a reader stands before an action that cannot be made painless. Ancient India's empires did not last. The Mauryas divided. The Guptas fragmented. Regional dynasties rose and disappeared. Their borders are difficult to draw and impossible to inhabit now. Their institutions left longer shadows. The Mauryan example made subcontinental unity imaginable even when rarely achieved. Ashoka offered a language in which kingship could be judged by welfare and restraint, even if later rulers did not follow it. Gupta patronage helped Sanskrit political and artistic forms travel widely. Monasteries, temples, guilds, and pilgrimage routes connected people beyond state boundaries. Ideas often survive because they did not depend upon one capital. A pillar can fall. A story can be retold beside another fire. A monastery can close. A teaching can cross a mountain. A manuscript can decay. A student can memorize. The first scene of this history showed an emperor after conquest. The oldest scene showed a city before its name was lost. Between them stood centuries of people trying to control uncertainty by storing water, preserving sound, performing ritual, building law, renouncing desire, calculating the sky, and telling stories about duty. None of these methods ended uncertainty. Reservoirs could empty. Oral lineages could break. Ritual could become hierarchy. Law could become oppression. Renunciation could depend upon the labor of others. Calculation could predict an eclipse, but not the fall of an empire. Yet each method gave human beings another way to live with change. The Buddha taught that conditioned things are impermanent. The Upanishadic sages searched for what does not pass. Jain teachers asked people to reduce the harm produced by every movement. Epic poets showed that duty can remain unclear even to heroes. Ashoka carved regret because action cannot always be recalled. Aryabhata calculated cycles in a sky that seems to move because the observer moves. These are not one philosophy. They are a civilization's long argument with time. At dusk, the heat above Khalsi begins to soften. The rock inscription holds the last light in its cut letters. A traveler pauses, perhaps because another person is reading aloud. Beyond them, water descends from the Himalayan foothills toward the Yamuna and the Ganges plain. Ashoka is already becoming memory. His officials will die. His descendants will lose provinces. The language of the inscription will change, and eventually no one nearby will understand the script. The stone will stand without explanation. Centuries later, the letters will be read again. The emperor's victory will be remembered because he wrote about sorrow. Far to the northwest, cities older than his empire will emerge from mounds. Their drains will be cleared. Their seals will be photographed. Their signs will remain silent. The contrast is fitting. One civilization left words no one can read. One emperor left words the world forgot and recovered. Between them, generations trusted the human voice enough to preserve hymns for thousands of years. Ancient India survives through all three forms of memory: the unread sign, the rediscovered inscription, and the living recitation. The sacred rivers bind them without explaining them. Water passes the ruins of old settlements and the foundations of new ones. It reflects temples, bridges, apartment towers, cremation fires, fishing boats, and electric lights. It receives flowers offered in devotion and chemicals released without care. The river remains sacred and endangered, ancient and immediate. So does the inheritance beside it. It is not one perfect golden age waiting behind the present. It is a deep and difficult past filled with beauty, violence, hierarchy, compassion, argument, and invention. It contains rulers who conquered and rulers who regretted. It contains philosophies of unity and societies of exclusion. It contains cities that planned drains and left no readable history. It contains teachers who owned nothing and transformed continents. To listen carefully is not to choose only the parts that flatter. It is to hear the whole current. The sun has gone from the Khalsi rock. The letters remain beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond sight, the rivers turn toward the plain and, much farther away, toward the sea. The empires have passed. The questions are still moving. Sleep well. Good night.